Welcome again to What's Up, Neighbors with Pam and Linda.
Welcome back.
What's Up, Neighbors?
And it's Pam and Linda again.
And we are so lucky. We are on the exquisite grounds of the Huntington Library, and you'll be able to see a little bit more later. But we're going to be interviewing Randy Shulman, who is delightful. And we've met him once before, and he's the Vice President for Advancement and External Relations, which really means he's a bigwig. And one quick fact about Randy is that he's a paid staff member now, but do you know that he volunteered when he was like 11 or 12? I mean, just he's been with the Huntington
So much
that long.
fun.
And
And
I think
when you're in
did
Southern
this too.
California, add this 207-acre destination to your must-see list. I mean, you won't be disappointed. It is absolutely magnificent in every imaginable way. And this is the Huntington's 100th anniversary celebration. So join us in wishing them a happy anniversary, and stay tuned to learn more about this San Marino marvel as we interview the special Randy Shulman.
Right. And one thing that Randy told us when we met with him earlier is that this is the only place in the entire world that has the library, the gardens, and the galleries all together. So it's really going to be exciting again
Oh,
to
I
talk
can't
to him.
wait.
So wait, is that so? Before we go,
Are you okay?
Is my scarf okay? Because I haven't worn a scarf for
Go like
years.
this with the little
Oh, thanks.
No,
Anyway,
it's okay.
but I have
It's
a friend, Susan Baggett, who she wears the most beautiful scarves, and she knows how to wear them. So I should have asked her before I came. because
Darn.
I have
Oh, well.
no idea
Next
what this
time.
looks like. Anyway, next time we're off to see Randy.
Yes.
Randy Shulman. It's going to be fun. Join us.
Welcome, Randy.
Thank you.
So nice
Thank
to
you.
see you.
Thank you.
Again, we've met him once before, and so many of you already know that Randy Shulman is the Vice President for Advancement and External Relations, which really, again, as I mentioned earlier, means a big shot.
Yes.
So,
He's in the money.
right. And as Linda mentioned, that this is their 100th anniversary, and we were just talking to Randy about this incredible, gorgeous ball, Centennial Ball, at the library, and it was just spectacular. So maybe he'll mention that later. But we're really excited to be in San Marino with this, and we are going to show you in a minute. We're at the home of Henry Huntington. This was his original home. They called it, but it's now the home to the Huntington Gallery. So this was where they started out. Okay.
Fabulous. And just out of curiosity, Randy, do you want to tell us a little bit about what's inside the gallery?
Well, this building was the largest house in Southern California until the 1990s.
Really?
When Aaron Spelling built his estate,
Okay.
that was larger than this house. But this house is something like 55,000 square feet inside.
Oh my goodness.
And it was built in 1911. And although it looks like an Italian kind of classical, neoclassical building, it's a 1911 reinforced concrete steel building. So it's a modern building that
Wow.
looks 250 years old.
Now, did they do that for earthquakes even back then?
They did that because they knew that just past the edge of the building is an earthquake fault. And this is before the Long Beach earthquake of 1933, and they really knew that they had to be careful, but they wanted the vantage point of being up on the top of this bluff looking at the whole San Gabriel Valley. So they made trade-offs, but also the reinforced concrete was becoming well used in building technique right around that time, and the architect Myron Hunt said, I can build you a beautiful building, and so this large house, which they probably knew someday would be more than a house, emerged, and we've had it ever since.
That's great, and we'll be showing you pictures of the house. It's right in front of us, but it's gorgeous. Could you tell us like some little hidden treasures about the home, like something we don't know, like when they had parties, did they have guest books? Or
Okay, good question. So they lived here from about 1913 until Arabella Huntington died in 1924, and then Mr. Huntington died in May of 1927. So there were about 10 years, I call it the golden 10-year period, where they were here. But in those days, wealthy people who were bi-coastal, when they meant living here, they meant 6 weeks here, 6 weeks somewhere else, 6 weeks here, 6 weeks somewhere else. So there were a lot of times where they weren't here, but they dressed for dinner every night, apparently. Came down to the dining room, perfectly set for their formal meal. And there are no pictures of the inside of this house when they lived here. There are a couple of photos of the loggia with the wicker furniture and the beautiful plants and the sculpture that's there.
and
But
what do
there-
you think that is? That
I
they
just
didn't
don't
have any
think.
photos?
I just don't think that. I think they were very
Private
private,
people.
and they probably didn't think of it as something that needed to be documented.
Okay.
They were both in their second marriage. They got married at age 60, both the same age.
Wow.
And she had had a son from a first marriage, and he had 4 kids from a first marriage.
Okay.
So there was, by the time they got together at 60, they were putting the family fortune back together again, which I'll have to explain to you.
Okay.
Because Arabella had been married to Mr. Huntington's uncle, Collis Huntington, first. And so Collis died, and Mr. Huntington, the nephew, was divorced. And a few years later, they started to correspond. And they both had the collector's genes. They loved to collect things. So Henry Huntington collected books, manuscripts, photographs, and Mrs. Huntington collected carpets, tapestries, paintings, and furniture, French decorative arts. So that together they had a lot of money from the first fortune, and then each of them had been wealthy in their own right. Arabella Huntington was an early land speculator in Manhattan. She was, from a very early age, active in New York City, and she sold land to the Carnegies, to the Fricks, and other people of that ilk, and was able to horse trade big blocks of land in Manhattan. So she made a lot of money. She was very, very,
doing that?
Yep,
I know.
She was very, very
Right.
smart. She was
Oh
very
my
beautiful,
gosh.
very astute.
Amazing. Henry Huntington was such a visionary, but let's say he showed up at the front doors. I know he's been gone for a few years, only 100, and he walked in to see what the Huntington Library and Gardens is like today. What do you think he'd say?
Oh, I live for that question, because we say to ourselves, if they came back to life, well, let's start with him.
Okay, yes,
If Mr. Huntington came back to life and walked around here, I think he would have the biggest smile on his face you can imagine. Because the seed that he planted was taking the things that they collected and growing those collections of similar objects, similar types of things, in his house, in the context of the house and their library, which is just through this little grove here. The library came a little bit later than the house, and the library has had 7 additions since it was built. Actually 6. It's 7 buildings altogether, because the collection has grown.
Well,
And so-
aren't there like 11 million items within
That's
the
right.
collection?
There's 11 million items in the library's collection. There's 42,000, something like 42,000 works of art in our art collections. About 37,000 are things that are prints, drawings, things on paper that can be, easily put away. But there's also 14 gardens here at Huntington. And so when Mr. Huntington was, in his beginnings of developing this was a working ranch. We had peaches and citrus of all kinds, and stone fruit, and they had chickens, and they had all sorts of things. They had a dairy. And so it was trying to get Arabella to leave Manhattan to come to Southern California. And it might be hard for those of you who live here now to imagine you couldn't get here from downtown LA. No 2 freeway to La Cañada. None of that. It took hours and hours to get here from downtown, and that was without traffic. You still could take hours and hours, but in the current times. But so getting out into the middle of the country was not her idea of fun. She wanted opera and symphony and fine things and paved streets and telephone exchanges, and so it took a while to convince her. And so what happened is that around this beautiful house that was eventually built, Mr. Huntington created a version of Versailles for Mrs. Huntington with beautiful vistas that, the productive horticulture gave way to a cultural garden. And that was the Japanese garden, the desert garden, the rose garden, the camellia garden, and other gardens followed. But if he would have woken up and walked around today and seen the Chinese garden and the expansion of the place, I think he would be more satisfied than you could ever believe. Because Mr. Huntington said, I'm not going to write about myself. The story will be written by the collections that I bring to this place and what scholars do with those things. And that's happened.
I love that because I took your class, Huntington 101, and it's 2 weeks. I encourage anyone to take it because...
It's not 2 weeks long total, it's 2 times.
No, yeah, 2 times, yeah.
Because I could talk for 2 weeks.
Because then I would be a scholar talking about it. But it was fascinating, the background that he has, and you learn about the collections, and you go on tours and you see behind the scenes and how it works. And it really, really is fascinating. It's a fabulous class, so thank you.
Pam had mentioned a guest book, and I don't know if that's still active, but I know that was Prince Charles was here and signed it Charles.
That's right.
And Linus Pauling and
Einstein.
Yeah, it goes on and on.
So there
and
is
on.
a guest book. We keep it in the president's office, and it started when Mr. Huntington was in residence. And there's the Crown Prince of Sweden visiting in 1926. Well, Mrs. Huntington was already passed away. There's all sorts of very early luminaries of Southern California. There might be a Douglas Fairbanks, one or two Hollywood people.
Did they stop it at a certain year? Like it's not signed
Well,
anymore?
it's clear to me that there's certain years, for a while they didn't pay attention to it. And then they did, and then they didn't.
okay.
So when you get into the 1980s, you start to see dinners that are held here by groups, where everybody in the group, the Grolier Club, which is a book collectors club, the Grolier Club was here, and everybody in attendance signed the book.
Oh
and
my
things
gosh,
like that.
that's great.
So more recently, we've had, we've gone back to using it. Well, we've had the Vice Premier of China here. We've had the Japanese tea master from 15 generations of tea masters. We have wonderful signatures. I had Kanye West here a couple weeks ago, and he did not sign the guest book.
What?
So Kanye, if you're watching, come back and sign the guest book.
So what was he doing here?
He was.
I mean,
he
going
was-
through the
Well, he
gardens,
was
right.
interested in our gardens, and he's thinking about developing an estate that he has, and he wanted to see
Oh
what
my
somebody
goodness.
in
Oh my
that day
gosh.
did with their gardens, and he was told by somebody, "You've got to go to the Huntington."
I bet
Oh
Kim
my gosh.
Kardashian would have signed that.
I know. In
That's
fact,
right.
you were asking me just the other day. You wanted to know about how many gardeners and what it takes to run
exactly.
the place.
We were curious about that. And what's your operating budget, and where does that money come from? I know you have an endowment, and I know you're chief financial or chief in charge of fundraising. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so this is a very big ship to run. And when Mr. Huntington put this into a trust,
Right.
he imagined that we would sell fruit from the orchards
Oh,
to run
that's
the
right.
operation here.
And what did the original leave? Wasn't it like a 8.5 million?
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. It was not very much. The first director of the library, Max Farron, did an evaluation and said it's going to take $24 million worth of endowment to manage the place at the level it should be. He left a third of that. And so what happened over the years is that the place, which for many years was free, it's still free for our education partners, many, many thousands of school children, and for all the scholars that come here. 1,800 scholars a year come to do
Yeah,
work.
that's
all
amazing.
free. But we couldn't keep a place of this kind of quality and improve it and run it for free. And everybody realized that. So it costs about $48 million a year to run this place. There's
Wow.
almost 500 employees now.
Oh,
And there's 1,000 volunteers plus. I think it's 1,100 volunteers. So we have a huge cadre of people that support this place. But one of the things I always like to tell people when they say, well, gosh, it used to be free. It did,
Oh, it did.
but it couldn't stay, it could
Yeah,
not
it couldn't
survive.
sustain itself,
So we
for
had to
sure.
make a decision, and we hope that people understand that it's valuable.
But there is one day that's free, right?
Well, the first Thursday of every month, we have free tickets. They're hard to get because they're competitive, and you have to go online to get them.
Okay.
But what we hope is that people become members. We have
Right.
44,000 families that are members here, and they can come when they want, and they can enjoy with their families. So what we want people to do is to become committed to the survival of places like this.
Right.
And we have many, many people that come here, and they have sparks of becoming artists, becoming historians, becoming doctors, where they do or see something here that means something to them. These places are important and worthy of that support. The other thing is that if you talk about LACMA or the Natural History Museum, LACMA gets almost $40 million a year from the county to help run, and we don't have that kind of
right.
opportunity, so we have to make it up.
Totally private.
So
Okay.
about a third of what it takes to run the place comes from our endowment.
Okay.
A third of it comes from contributions, and a third comes from earned revenues. And earned revenues are admissions, the store, filming. We have a lot of filming here. This has been a movie set,
Well,
and a
like
TV
today.
set. Right,
Yes,
right.
right,
Here we go.
exactly.
But every bad wedding movie you've ever seen was filmed here.
Every bad
movie, I
bad
love
bit?
it.
Every bad wedding movie.
Oh,
No.
bad wedding.
Right.
Oh,
Bridesmaids.
Bad bit.
Oh, that's I like
Monster-in-law,
bridesmaid.
wedding
Yes, that's
planner,
pretty funny.
American wedding, they were all filmed here.
Funny.
It's funny. Before we go to the Chinese garden, is there anything else you want us to know about the house? And again, we'll show you pictures. But anything?
Well, there's
we
something
need to
great
know.
about this house that most people don't do, which is to go upstairs.
Mm.
And upstairs, there's a collection right in this corner on the east side of the house that is Renaissance art, Renaissance paintings.
Mm.
And it is lesser known, but there are some incredibly valuable old masters here that people adore. Many people know. The people watching this will say, I've known about that my whole life.
Yeah.
But from people who don't know, going upstairs in the Huntington Mansion, spending that extra 15, 20 minutes or an hour is so worth it. And there's much to see up there.
Oh my!
Well, I have
gosh,
to say,
that's
you
great.
know, both Pam and I used to bring our families, our kids over here with John, and it's changed so much within the last 20 years. So hats off to you.
Thank you.
Because
Thank
you've
you.
done
Oh,
an
you've done
Well,
a
it's been
remarkable
fun.
job.
It's been fun.
Well, if you believe in something and are passionate, this is what happens. I mean, it just grows. So,
Right. So I think
off
we're
to
going
the
to go
Chinese
up to the
garden.
Chinese
Okay,
garden.
see you in a
Great.
minute.
Thank
Wonderful.
you, Randy. Okay.
Well, we are here now in the a new part of the gardens is the Chinese gardens or the flowing gardens. Is that
Garden of Flowing Fragrance.
the garden
sound
of
pretty.
flowing grape fragrance? And you started developing this in 2008.
So this opened in 2008. We started developing it in the 90s.
Oh,
It started out as a
okay.
little idea because the director of the gardens, Jim Folsom, woke up one day and realized that more than half of the plants that live in the Huntington's collections owe their ultimate origins to China and Asia.
Interesting.
And so they wanted to create a garden, a space that had the context of China and Chinese plants and Chinese culture. So it started out as a little idea to have a stream and a pavilion and some signage and a bench, very pleasant. And that idea became the snowball, which got bigger and bigger. And people got more enthusiastic about bringing an authentic Ming Dynasty Suzhou style scholars garden to the Huntington. And then people in China got very excited too, because many Chinese gardens end up as sister city projects where they build a pavilion and put it in a park somewhere and everybody says that's beautiful, but they don't have any context. So at the Huntington we wanted to create a garden that would have the life of what it's like in China. Poetry, music, calligraphy, and also every spot in this garden was planned according to some kind of historical allegory. So there's a name for every little thing in this garden, which is beautiful. The people who train to be docents in this garden, they have to go through a manual that's about 2 inches thick because it's so incredibly detailed.
What's your favorite part of the garden, would you say?
Well, behind us there's a little stream, and that stream has a pavilion at the bottom that has a thatched grass top. And
I think we
it's
just
the-
filmed that.
And it's
Yeah,
called the
we'll show.
Pavilion for Washing Away Thoughts.
Oh.
And that's the beginning of getting yourself ready to come into
Cleanse.
the Chinese garden.
Oh, I
Okay.
love that. That's just
Wow.
great.
But when this project got to be serious, a lot of people became involved and said, we will help you build this. Because it was going to be a $100 million project, it was going to be way too complicated.
Wow.
And we couldn't build ultimately something that big that fast. So we built it in 2 phases. And the first phase is a $20 million phase, which opened in 2008. We did a little bit more in 2014 with that boat pavilion that looks like a boat on the lake.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful waterfall behind it, and that all opened in 2014.
Wow.
And then we said, what do? Do we try to finish it? It's another $15 to $25 million, or is it beautiful and we should be happy with what we have?
Sure.
And people came to us and said, you must finish it. The hillside on the west side of the garden behind us there did not look like the rest of the garden. It was unfinished. And you could tell that something else was meant to be there. So there's a series of pavilions up on that hill. One of them is a penjing pavilion. Penjing is like bonsai. So beautiful miniature plants that will be well tended, very interesting for people, around a variety of screened walls that have beautiful views of the garden below. And then there's a pavilion up on the hill that's called the Stargazing Pavilion, which is looking down on the garden, very beautiful, the highest point in the garden. And then behind these trees, in the north part of the garden, there are 2 art galleries being built to be able to display art, Chinese or not Chinese, contemporary or historical. One of them is a glass enclosed building which is for materials that can't be damaged by light, and then the other one is a gallery which has a lot of controls for sensitive light objects like calligraphy and works on silk and things like that, paper.
Oh my gosh. Don't you just love these leaping
These trees
willows?
are amazing.
Those are
Oh, they're
just, can you see them?
gorgeous.
John, I mean, it's just, that's a beautiful picture.
And you see the geese over there. The geese have adopted us. The ducks have
Oh, yeah,
adopted
they're,
us.
oh, how
Boy,
cute.
I'd like to come back as a son this
Yes,
pond.
yes,
Goose on
this
this
is-
pond.
You do that,
That'd be-
Linda.
Yeah, right.
But again-
Quack, quack.
So this is now almost $70 million have been raised. And part of it is to
it's
endow
so-
the operation of the space.
Oh my.
And then
But-
when do you envision completion?
May of 2020.
Oh, so
That's next
coming
year.
up.
Next May.
Wow.
The
So that's in a
construction,
year.
there are 54 Chinese artisans that are working up on that hill. They've been here, some of them since April. They've
Wow.
come in shifts.
And they're directly from
China?
Suzhou, from
or-
Suzhou, from our,
Oh, wow.
our partner in China, which is the Suzhou Design Garden and Design Institute, which builds Chinese gardens. And so they are working with us, and it's been a fabulous experiment. They're artisans, so they're here displaying their techniques and their skills, and then we have a crew that goes behind them and helps them. So, but this will all open to the public in late May of 2020.
So portions of it are open to the public.
Most
is
of
that
it's
correct?
open, but the
Okay.
part up on the hill behind that fence is
Right.
not open.
And so to ask you, we just have a few questions. What is your favorite part of the entire library when people ask you? Is it the mausoleum or not?
Did I tell you that when I met you before?
Well, I'm trying to remember. I think you might have.
Well, tell us a little bit.
Tell us something
Tell us a little
else.
bit about the mausoleum because that's got an interesting history.
Well, the
especially
mausoleum,
the architect.
Yeah, the mausoleum was built in 1928. It was built after they died. Mr. Huntington commissioned it from John Russell Pope. And for those of you who are intrepid enough to go look at the mausoleum, it is a prototype for the Jefferson Memorial.
Right.
And it is a smaller building. Does not have the little portico in the front, but it has essentially designed. It's actually more elegant than the Jefferson Memorial.
Wow.
And so Mr. Huntington wanted him and Mrs. Huntington to be buried there, and they made arrangements for that. She did not want to be in California, and in the end she agreed.
Oh,
And so
wow.
they were buried there in 1928. They've been there ever since. But that building and the knoll that it sits on is very beautiful, and very few people visit now because the changes in the pathways. It's just not as accessible. It will be again, and we
Good.
want people to rediscover it and spend time there. It's one of my favorite spots.
So it is.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
great.
you know, Pam and I were talking about if you've never been to the Huntington before, and where do you start? I mean, do you have? I mean, the visitor center is a good start.
Yeah, you
but,
get an orientation.
I mean, there's
and
so
you get,
much. You can't even do it in a day.
No, we don't want you to have to. We want you to become lifelong members here and come back whenever you want and bring
Okay.
people. And what happens is it's like biting an apple. You get one bite at a time. You come, you experience something, you get lost. I know you've all gotten lost here, whether you wanted to or not. And over time, you discover more and more of it, and you acquire it in your mind of how to go and what's. And at the same time, we switch it up. So there are different things on display. There are many, many exhibits at once. Sometimes we have 4 or 5 things at once on display that are special exhibits. And we also want this place to continue to be dynamic. It's not a static thing. Everything changes here.
Right.
And so we have kept up with trying to make the place very interesting and relevant to people, but also to bring things out of our collections, out of the storage, so that people can see what's in these magical collections. The whole idea is not just to have them locked up,
Right.
but to have them available for people to understand,
Right.
work with them, use them, experience them, and let
Is-
the voices come out.
Isn't he a wealth of knowledge? I mean, I'm telling you.
Absolutely.
Walking Encyclopedia, we appreciate it so much. So before we end, any final thoughts or questions or anything that we need to know or we haven't talked
Well,
about? or-
I just think you need to keep your eye on the Huntington. Huntington is not going to be shy and retired.
Yes, you said
It is-
it's a
Good.
work in progress.
It's a work in progress,
like
and
that.
there's always something new here.
Great.
So please come visit us and be our guest.
Right,
And
we're
happy
going,
anniversary.
And we're going to have the website on the on our show and all that. So there's just so much to see. Randy, thank you again.
My pleasure. It's so
It
nice
is-
to talk with you.
We are so
Oh,
fortunate
this is
to be able
wonderful.
to interview you. Thank you so much. So stay
Thank you.
tuned for our next show with Randy Shulman.